Hi everyone, hope you guys are doing well. Welcome to the day 4 of the Tricky Java Backend Developer Interview Question Series. So, if you're watching this video for the first time or you're new to the channel, I would highly recommend you to first subscribe to the channel, follow along, and watch the series from the day one. Now, I would also like to share what is the right way of watching this series and following it along because it is very important for you to not binge watch the series but to actually pay attention and be interactive with the videos that I'm doing and not treat it like some kind of a cheat sheet or a shortcut to crack an interview because the concepts are very much in depth, very much actionable, very much real worldish, and you need to sit attentively, probably with a notebook and a pen, take down notes. I've also repeated this in the previous video also, and I'm telling you this again. Please be very attentive while you're watching the videos. Take down notes, take down topic references, question references, do some extra homework, some extra effort on your part is also needed to research on similar kind of questions on the similar topics which I have already discussed. This video series is meant to be like a teaser for all the potential topics and questions and subtopics and the kind of questions that will be asked in your backend developer interviews. And very, very importantly, the concepts which you have to take along even post your interview to your daily work. So with that, please approach the series as if you are learning something and you are going to retain those for a long time. And as you know, anything to be retained for the longer time, we have to kind of take down the notes of. That is what we have been taught since childhood. So if you don't take notes, if you do not be attentive, you're going to forget in a very short span of time. And I'm sure none of us want to forget the concepts in a very short span of time post the interview is done. So on that note, let's begin the video. Starting with the first question, what happens when you run mvn clean install and mvn clean deploy? So we'll understand and try to break it down. As the name suggests, mvn clean install, maven clean install. Now, what does clean mean? Clean is a lifecycle phase in which it is going to delete that target directory where it actually will put our artifacts. So in order to do a fresh build every time, we do a mvn clean install, clean the older artifacts and do a fresh build. So what are the life cycle phases? What happens behind the scenes? First, it will do validate. Now, all these phases are individual commands. You can also run them as individual commands like mvn clean compile, mvn clean test, like that. But when we do mvn clean install, basically it is bundling up all of these phases into one command. First, it will validate, then it will compile, run the compiler, run the unit test. When the mvn clean install command runs, you will be also seeing the same on the console. Then it is trying to package it into the necessary artifact like jar and verify and finally install it to your local repository, which is M2 repository. If you go to your M2 repository, that is where your artifact and all the other dependencies also exist. So this is what happens in your mvn clean install phase. Why do we need this? First, to do a fresh build of course, and to get a new build artifact. Next is mvn clean deploy. The only word which changes is install becomes deploy, which means our artifact needs to be put out somewhere. It needs to be deployed somewhere. So clean phase will still remain the same. All the other lifecycle phases are also going to be the same. The only difference is now it needs to be deployed somewhere, some local place, some remote place. Okay, so it deploys the build artifact to a remote repository, whatever we have defined within the distribution management element in the pom.xml. If I show you the IntelliJ, if you see this particular POM XML, here we have a distribution management and we have defined repository. For my case, I don't have any remote repository setup as of yet. So I've done that. Once you do the mvn clean deploy, please deploy this to my local OneDrive desktop. If you specify a remote repository, that should also work. Usually that is what we deploy to. So now the follow-up question is, what will happen if there is no distribution management defined in the POM XML? Very obviously, it is not going to work because Maven requires the place. You need to define the place where it is going to deploy your artifact. So if you do not say where it is going to deploy, it will just tell you that, it will throw you an error that it could not find this particular element, right? So that is the summary. So that is what is about mvn clean deploy and mvn clean install. Next question is, what does settings.xml contain and why do we need it? So in many places, you might have seen in the M2 repository, in that location, you would have a settings.xml, or maybe when you join a new company or a team, they will pass on the settings.xml and ask you to put it in your M2 location. It contains certain information which is going to be useful when you do the build process locally. So what is the significance of this XML file? Right, that is what we are going to discuss. So it is typically located in the M2 directory and not the repository folder. It is directly, you should be putting it under this particular location. Okay. Now, what are the things that it contains? So, majorly we'll discuss some of the important tags or the elements that it contains. First is this local repository tag, which you would see. I will also show you an entire settings.xml at the end. So, let's talk tag wise. So, if there's a local repository tag, basically, as we know, anything related to Maven, we go and search in the M2. But if you want to override that location, you can put whatever location you want inside this local repository tag. That will become your custom local repository instead of M2. Next is the very important tag or the section called servers. So let's say when you're doing the deployment, okay, and you want to connect to a remote repository. So you have to give the credentials, otherwise it will not be able to connect to it, right? So in that you will specify all the credentials information under this servers. Proxy is again the proxy setting, all the proxy related host, port, username, password. In certain cases, we also use that. So all the proxy setting related information will be put inside this proxies. Next is the profiles. Now for dev, staging, and prod, we have different profiles usually. So if you are using, trying to run it locally, or maybe you want to use the dev profile, then you can set it up like this and then use it accordingly. Let me show you one example, settings.xml. I think that it will be even more clearer. So like we said, first is the local repositories. Usually it will use user home, like we said. This is one thing. This is important. The second part which is important is the mirrors. So mirrors is basically alternate location where from where it should fetch the dependencies. It actually helps you in reducing the latency. So usually a certain dependency it will by default always try to download from Maven Central. But in your company, if you want that to be cached to some your internal repository like a Nexus or Artifactory, then you can map it to this mirror. So all the dependencies will get downloaded from your internal repository than doing a external calls to the Maven Central every time. So mirrors are really very helpful for your internal repository, like caching all the dependencies over there. So it will fetch from there instead of doing the Maven Central. So it's written over here for Central, fetch it from this company's internal repository. So this is one thing which is defined in the settings XML. Again, if you're behind a corporate proxy, right? So these are the things which you have to write in your settings.xml. And always remember any username, password, credentials do not store it directly under settings.xml. Maven has its own password encryption policy. You can use that. Same now for server, like we just now discussed. So if it has to connect to any private repositories or anything like that, all of those, even the mirror settings, all of those credentials will be stored in this. This is what it is going to refer using this particular ID, which you will define in the pom.xml. So this is again the username password. Don't store it directly in the settings.xml, even though it is in your local. Uh, Next is the enabling the profiles, like customized builds for your different stages, dev, staging, prod. So you can have the, for dev, what is the repository I want to look into, what are the releases, if it should be true or not, if I want snapshots or not. So all of this information you can specify over here. Okay. And which is the active profile, that also you can mention over here. Then you have the properties. So everything, it is more like a metadata. Okay, all the metadata information and the overriding information and all the credential information, head, like the super parent of the XML file, right, of the pom.xml. So this is the significance of knowing every tag or element inside your settings.xml. Moving to the next question. Why do we need Maven plugins? So you may have heard of the very famous plugin called the Maven compiler plugin. There are many more plugins. So why do we need plugins? Let's discuss about it. Plugins are a way to enhance the capability of Maven. Maven, we know, okay, will do Maven to install. It will build the project and give us the jar file. But beyond that, also there are many more capabilities which we can make use of using the plugins, the add-ons. Plugins, you can think of it like add-ons to automate and customize various aspects of the build process. First of all, the Maven compiler plugin, very important, and the most prominent one and must include. So your Java source code, which needs to be compiled by which specific version of the Java, you specify all of that. And this is the basis of which that compile phase will run. Then you have a surefire plugin. So the importance of this question is to know, you may be asked about the plugins. What does this plugin do? Or you may be asked, what is the importance of this plugin? Or tell a couple of plugins you have used. In this way, you will be asked the questions. Surefire plugin is mainly to run the unit test and to ensure code quality. So this Surefire plugin, if you include, the unit test will be running. Next is, this is very important, the shade plugin. If you want to independently run the jar, it will create a shaded jar or a fat jar or a Uberized jar, we say. So this is going to bundle up all your dependencies into one single jar. A very important use case of this is in AWS, let's say you're running serverless. So in a Lambda function, when you will build and give your jar, make sure you have to give a shaded jar. If you do not give a shaded jar, it is going to give you that, okay, this class not found exception, right? Because it will not able to find the third party dependency jar because you have not packaged it into your jar. Maven site plugin. So if you do Maven clean site, if you run this command, you will be able to see this also. Let me run this for you. So let's say I'll just run one ambient clean site. So it'll give you a broader, like a bird eye view of all the things which is there in your project, all the stuff that you have, right from your dependencies, your artifacts, all the information, necessary information, your project details, you'll be getting from your Maven site plugin. Many a times the site plugin is used and that site information is put on the release information. When you're putting out a release, that release information requires the site information. So that is required in that. So okay, the build is running. Let's see. So if you can see site colon 3 12 1. So this is the Maven site plugin, which is actually running. Now, can you see this clean is running? Now it is saying deleting this target directory. So it's very evident from if you follow the logs of the Maven clean install or any kind of a command, you will be understanding what is happening behind the scenes. So if you see in the this thing, it is saying that these are the reports which are detected, and also it is trying to generate the dependencies report. So what are the dependencies my project have? If I have a small project, fine, but if I have a big project, if I run this, I'll be able to get a list of all the dependencies, and this is very useful during the release cycle. See, the build is success now, and in the target folder, if you see, there's a site folder. Within this, you have index.html, and that is what I have opened over here. So this is going to give you the description and all. Then if you click on one of these, each of these, you'll get all the dependencies, Maven, then the dependency management section where you'll have all the versions, license and everything, plugin management, and you'll have the plugins. Okay. So basically, and also a project summary. So here, whatever things that you have specified, the team information. So this site information is very useful because it has the version, date, and everything to be shared during release notes when you're doing some deployment, right? So that time it is very important. So that is why it is very useful to know about this plugin also. Then the next plugin is Maven deploy plugin. Okay, so this is what is going to help you to uploading your artifact to your remote repositories. Next is check style plugin. We use this in many places so that we adhere or align with the coding standards, right? To have a good code quality. This check style plugin will have your different rules and everything which you can set up. Next is a Java doc plugin. It is going to generate your from the comments and everything. It is going to create your Java docs. That is also important. Enforcer plugin. Okay, so enforcer plugin is basically going to give you again some rules being set up. If this dependencies, there are some conditional rules being set up so that you do not get conflicts and all of that. So presence of certain dependency in case of the presence of some other jar, all of that. It's a little complex topic to talk about, but basically just to give you a bird eye view of all the different plugins that exist in Maven and what is the significance of each of them, and overall why do we need plugins? That is the point of having this question included. Next question is, how does Maven determine which remote repository from where it has to download the dependencies? So there is a order which maintains. First of all, it will check into your local repository. Remember the local repository, which was our M2. It will check there. Then it will check in the Maven Central. Then it will check in your remote repositories, which you might have defined under your repositories section. If none of the places it will find for that particular dependency, it will say that it was not able to find. This is the order which it maintains: local, then central, then the remote, right? And this is the order in which it is going to check for which repository it is going to download the dependencies from. Next question is provide some real-time use case on when to use singleton scope and prototype scope. So you have to understand this, when to use which one, right? So singleton, by default, all the beans that you create in Spring Boot are singleton, which means only one instance of that is being created in the Spring IOC container. Usually we will use this whenever we need that one instance to be shared across logging, database configuration. We want one instance of it, not every time an object is created, we don't want a new instance of that, right? But in case of prototype, it is little different. Prototype, a new instance will be created whenever you are requesting for that bean. I will be getting a completely new instance, which means my hash code is going to change for that particular bean every time. And this is useful when you want to maintain sessions, statefulness, right? So you don't want one instance to be shared across all the different, like one instance to be shared across the entire application. So in that case, you should be using this prototype scope. We'll also see a quick code demo of that. So just one thing you clearly remember, singleton is for stateless components that you want to be reused across the application lifecycle. Prototype is for the stateful or the request specific components. So that is one important thing which you have to understand, that when to use which one. So if I show you in the IntelliJ, this is one class. So there's a class called prototype bean where I have defined it as component, because if you don't define it as component, beans will not get created. And at the red scope here, we have two scopes, singleton and prototype. The value of this is prototype. So you can use this constants instead of writing prototype. So once you write this, then I've just written one simple sysout. Similarly, another class for singleton. I could have also written scope equal to, configurable bean factory dot singleton, but by default all the beans are anyway singleton, so you can omit this particular scope annotation also. If I go into the main method, this is how we are trying to test it, that we will just say application context dot get bean. So these are the two classes, I mean two instances which we have created, and we are trying to check if they are equal using the equal to. And next, in the prototype bean, we are also going to check if they are equal. Okay, so if I run this, let's see what does it print out. So if you can see, these are the two different, okay, these are the two beans. The address is printed over here. If are the same, it is saying true, because if you see the hash code, it is same, right? And here it is also printing that hi, I'm prototype, whatever we are trying to print out. But are they the same? No, because the memory address are different. There are two different objects. So this clearly shows us that whenever you're using prototype scope, the beans which are getting created are not going to be the same every time a new bean or a new object or new instance is getting initialized. So that is the main thing which you have to understand, and then accordingly use it in whatever scenario you're using it. Now we will talk a little bit about Docker. So let's revise some Docker commands, and then we'll talk about some questions, interview questions on Docker. So Docker commands are very useful, especially when your application needs to be containerized. Okay, CI/CD pipelines need to be set up, put it up on cloud. So you have to be very fluent with the Docker commands. So I've tried to assemble all the commands that we most importantly use it. The very first thing is, first you have a code like your application and you have written a Docker file. After writing the Docker file, you have to build an image out of it. And once you build the image, you have to test if your image that you have built is running successfully. So point number 7 and point number 5, to run the container and to build the image, these two are very important. Apart from the fact that you also want to list the Docker images, you want to list what are the running containers and all the different commands. You can pause the video, take a note of the commands, and also try to do a dry run. Now I'm going to show you one small dry run on how we are using it. So I'll show you a Docker file. This is a simple Kafka producer service. Okay, now let me show you this particular command that I've just now run. So I've just run Docker images command. So I'm able to see all the different images, when was it created, the tag and everything. And this is the Docker file which I have. So this is the OpenJDK, the base image, the runtime on which my jar is going to run. This is the directory in which I'm going to copy the jar like this. And the CMD, which is going to be like the command which needs to be. So basically I want my Docker container to run as an executable. So then I'm using CMD. You can use entry point also. We'll talk about CMD and entry point in a while. So this is a very basic, simple Docker file when you're trying to run a Java Spring Boot jar. Now, I want to build this image first with the command docker build -t. Then I'll say, let's say Kafka service, and then dot denoting the current directory, and I'll hit enter. So now you can see it is saying it is loading the information from the Docker file. Then it did a from this, try to download this runtime, then transferring context, and then doing all of this command one by one. So now if I do Docker images, now if I run Docker images, I should be seeing my image. So this is my Kafka service, which has been created 41 seconds ago. Now I want to run this. So I'll just simply say docker run Kafka service. So my Spring Boot app should get started. So as we can see, just as normally any Spring Boot jar application started, it has started on the 8080. Simple. So this is how I've just used two Docker commands to build and run the application. Similarly, there are other commands also which will be handy, but the very basic, the starting point is these two commands. The next question is around the Docker build process and the caching and the role of Docker files. So this question can be asked in many different ways. Probably they'll be asked you to define or maybe talk about a certain command in the Docker file that we use, about the layers, the caching. So I'll try to cover all the different concepts so that you can answer it accordingly. So as we have just seen, there's a Docker file, a simple text file, which has the instructions on how to build your image, the Docker image, which you eventually want to run independently. So like we saw that from, which will specify the base image. In our case, we use the JDK runtime, right? The run command, as we can see that certain command which you want to uh, execute. We have CMD, entry point, and copy on it. So now these are the different, on a very high level, these are some of the commands which you would need to build your image step by step. So every instruction that you write in the Docker file essentially creates a layer. So that is a very technical term. It's like a layer of, cakes, one layer and then another layer. So all of these layers are being cached by the Docker, so that let's say you are doing a Docker build again and again, but you're not changing much. So it will try to reuse the same layers. For example, if I just show you this, if I have done this from OpenJDK 11 JRE Slim, if I run this Docker build command 100 times also, it is not always going to get the OpenJDK base image directly from like doing a network call and downloading it. If it is already downloaded, it will be cached probably for some period. And then once it is cached, again, if I build it, it will be reusing this. So that is the thing about the layer caching mechanism. Next is about the image layer. So every instruction, like we said, will add a new layer. So that is what you can also see in the output over here. If I scroll up a little bit, exporting layers, writing this image, cached, if you can see, right? So all of this is just essentially building one layer. So this is the layer caching thing. So it will reuse the cached version instead of rebuilding it, essentially reducing the network calls and speeding up the building of the image. Next concept is about multi-stage builds. So this is a very important concept when you're trying to productionize your application and you want the size of the Docker image to be very minimal. You want to speed up the build process. So there will be multiple from instructions and you will try to separate your build environment and the run environment. I'll show you one example also. If I go to this, I have another Docker file called multi-stage. So here we were trying to build the jar first and then we already know it is there in the target and then I'm copying the jar. So I'm actually skipping the building of the jar phase. But if you see this, here I'm using Maven OpenJDK 11, setting up the work directory. Here, the mvn clean installs command, I am not running it. In the sense, I am first copying the POM XML. I'm copying the source where I have the code. I'm running the Maven clean package. Okay. So what this package is doing, remember Maven clean install has this particular phase of packaging the application. So it will just package that into a jar. So I'm running this. It is going to package it. Once it is packaged, this is the stage 2. The first stage was to package it. In the second stage, what I'm doing, I know when I've packaged, I already have a jar being created over here. Now I'm going to copy that jar to this particular location. So the second half of what I'm doing, this is done in the run environment stage. And the first part is the building stage. So in this way, you can have multiple stages according to your requirement. And finally, we are running it. So this is the necessity because you want to have the final image, right, to be smaller. You unnecessarily don't want to include a certain base image, because if you notice, if I again go to this Docker file, see this jar, I mean this base image and this base image is different. If unnecessarily I'll include the Maven dependency to build my particular code, that Maven dependency is redundant. I ultimately need an executable to run. I don't need the Maven's package, compile, all of that things to happen for my final production environment, because I already built it. Built it like you use Jenkins CI/CD to build it. Once you build it, you have your artifact. Now you deploy it. So the second part, the second stage is essentially only talking about the executable. So that is the reason why multi-stage builds are important, so that you can copy only whatever necessary it is from one stage to another. Okay. Finally, to reduce the image size, like we said, for prod, we don't want bulky images. And caching features, like we have said, the each layer is cached. You can also try to bypass this thing using this particular flag, so that it will force the Docker every time whatever you change, it will force the Docker to rebuild every single layer. And finally, like we have just seen, we run the Docker run to run this. So if you do not know the entire backstory of this, you will not be able to work with Docker. So, and forget about answering any question on Docker. So yeah, that is the intent of adding this question. Okay, so here is our next question on Docker's these two commands or instructions, CMD versus entry point. Now, the structure of using these two commands are very similar, and it is often confused, like which one to use when, or can we use them together? So now both the instructions are used to denote how the container should start. Essentially, there's a difference. So when we use CMD, it is like the default command that we wanted to execute, and it can also be overridden when we use Docker run, and then we can use arguments to override whatever we have specified. So if I've written CMD echo hello world, so that is what when I'm going to run this Docker image, Docker container, then I'm going to get hello world. Okay, so it's going to output hello world, but I can also override like Docker run the name of the image, and then instead of echo hello world, I can say echo something else or some other command, whatever it can be. So if you do that, and then when you will run, then you will be getting instead of hello world hi there, because you have essentially overridden this particular command. By default, it is going to run, but if you choose to override using Docker run, that also you can do. But in case of entry point we will use to specify that instruction or that command when we want to run that container as an executable, when we want our container to behave as an executable, and where we can also pass arguments. But the command, whatever we have specified inside the entry point, that itself is going to run, that is fixed. If you see this example, here, if I have written entry point echo hello is always going to be like the hello is always going to be printed no matter what. Even if I try to override it, it will be still be printing hello. Okay. Now, hello, echo hello means it is going to print hello. So, hello will anyway be printed. On top of that, if you pass an additional argument, you will get hello word. That is going to get appended to it. We can pass additional arguments to it, but we cannot completely override the content only. That instead of echo hello, I'm going to start with, let's say, Varsha. I cannot do that. If I have to combine these together, now if that is the beautiful part of it, that if you combine this together, now see the difference. I'm saying entry point will be echo, which means something has to be echoed. What has to be echoed? That is specified in the command. So now you see both of them are working together. Entry point is echo. The echo command has to anyway run, not the ls command, not the pwd command. The echo has to run. So that is one thing which is fixed. You cannot override that. But what you want to echo can be changed. So if I say docker run my image hello world will be printed, because that is the default command. If I want to override that and pass something else, then that will get printed. But getting printed, which means the echo command is anyway going to still run, because that is specified inside the entry point. So the differences are CMD can be overridden like we have seen by passing in additional arguments to Docker run, but entry point will run no matter what, unconditionally. but arguments that are passed will be treated as additional parameters to whatever you have specified in the entry point. Now it should be very clear. Any Docker file that you see that both the commands are being used, you can try to understand why both commands are being used, or if it is really necessary for the entry point to be in that way. Or can we use it? Can we switch instead of entry point? Can we switch CMD? Can we use both of them together? After understanding this, it should be very clear that when to use CMD, when to use entry point, and when to use both of them together. The next question is a very popular question, that how do you secure your Docker containers? Okay, security is such a concern nowadays that any single line of code that you're writing in the Docker file should be such that it should not create some additional vulnerabilities. So very importantly, the base image should come in not from any random source. It should come from a very trusted source. It should be there in some Docker registry, right? So always pull the images from trusted source, like Docker's official repository if you're using, and if you have a corporate repository, you can pull from there. Apply the principle of least privilege. Run containers with minimal permission. So we can also use chmod, right? So whenever you're using it, make sure that you're not giving unnecessary permissions to any of the executable. Never run it as root. So in one of our projects, there was this thing that the user was being run as root, and that caused a potential vulnerability, and we had to fix it. So never run them as root. Keep the Docker environment up to date. Okay. Secure the communication. Again, use TLS for encryption and all. But this initial points are important. Use secure. So okay, security scanning and monitoring tools. There are a lot of different tools available in the market. So that should be able to audit your Docker file that you are building, because Docker file which we have shown to you now is a very small, just for a very simple application. Productions Docker files are usually very lengthy. Okay, it will easily span between 25 to 50 lines. So, so there, being able to use a tool which will scan your Docker file to tell you about the vulnerabilities is very important. So always ensure that every line of instruction that you're writing in the Docker file has to be such that it should not introduce any security vulnerability. Make sure you adhere to the best practices. So this is something which you may get asked in your interview also, that what are your plans? How do you plan to secure? So just talk about one or two points that should tell them that you know about it. So towards the final list of questions, we'll talk about Docker volumes. So you may be asked about if you have used Docker volumes, and some questions around maybe some commands. So what is the use? Which scenarios you'll use a Docker volume and all of that. So we'll talk about this. Any data which you need to store persistently outside of your container, because you can start and stop the container, you can remove the container, but you won't want your data to disappear. So any persistent data storage will require your Docker volumes. So any stateful application, if you want to deploy, you will need Docker volumes. Okay. So that is the primary use case of Docker volumes. Now it is up to you. It is optional if you want to use Docker volumes or you want to store the persistent data somewhere else. So what are the use cases? Like, for example, you can mount a volume to the storage directories, right? So anything that you are using database with and you want the data to be persisted even when the container is stopped, you can use that. Maybe some data application is generating, right? Some important application data that can be stored in the volume so that your container can interact with it. Something you want to cache, that also. So these are some of the very typical use cases in which you would use a Docker volume. How would you use it? The main important flag is this -v, which denotes the mounting of the, like, starting the container with this particular volume. So what we have done, we have just simply used like this. I'll just go to my IntelliJ and I'll show you. Docker run it means interactive, -v means we are saying that we want to create a volume named demo underscore volume, and we want to create it in the /data directory. And this is the Ubuntu image which we are using. Okay, there's extra dollar. Okay, so now we are into this. Now if I just simply do ls data, because we want this data has been created, like this directory of data has been created. Okay. So right now, just before running, I had also tried to create one more directory. So that is why you're seeing this. So if you see the command over here, a volume called demo volume is mounted to the right term is the volume called this is mounted to the data /data directory inside the container. That is why we can do all of this interaction, because we are using IT. And now, because this, now you see there is a folder called /data. Now you can play around with this. Okay, so you can add some file or whatever you can do with this. So now this is some data which is apart from your slash app where we were trying to deploy our code in the previous Docker file, if you remember, we're using slash app. Now we have a slash data. Now we can, because we have already mounted this, now we can play around with this. We can store some data over here, right? For example, we were also trying to do this. So for example, this is Java Spring Boot app. Now that let's say you have a data directory. So probably you can try to copy your application.properties into this. And you would want whenever your Spring Boot jar will start, it should point to that particular location where you have put the application.properties. That can be something which you can also try it out. So this is what about Docker volumes is and the importance of using this. Okay, so how do you debug issues in a Docker container? This is very, very important. So just before doing this video, I was also trying to play around a bit and I was facing some issues. So I can do a couple of things. Now this exec minus IT have just now shown that you are going to initiate a shell inside this container. You are going to try if at all your directory was created or not. So this is something which you can try directly by accessing the shell inside this. Apart from that, you can see the logs. So like I'm using Docker desktops over here. These are the containers, right? So for example, I'm opening this and I want to see what is the, not this one. Let me open something else. Let's say these are the logs, right? So there was one error log, probably not here. There was some. So if you see, this is application failed to start. So this is how I can see by seeing the logs, because this is a GUI which is going to show you the logs. But you can also put this command docker logs and you can get the container ID from here. Like this is the container ID. This is also one way. Then you can do docker inspect. Everything about the container you can get, which you can also get from here. This is the inspect. So this is just the parallel. The GUI is basically running the command and giving it to us. So we have seen the logs, we can do inspect, we can see what are the bind mounts, then what are the different container files, all of that we can see over here. So either you can use Docker desktop, or but if it is in a production environment or something, maybe you can try to do run all of these commands. So it's very important to know the commands which you should use. Like if your Docker thing is running or not, like the process is running or not, you can use Docker PS. After doing the Docker run, if you want to see if your Docker run was successful, you can do Docker PS. Exec is very handy. Okay, so now these are the certain things which you have to remember. Okay, when you're trying to troubleshoot any issues, whatever, if your Docker container is not running or something. So yeah, with that we are wrapping today's video. We have talked about a lot of different things on Docker and Maven. Hope you guys have got some insights. But again, I would like to say that please do your own due diligence also. It is not possible for me to cover hundreds of questions. There can be hundreds of questions on Maven and Docker. Try to highlight the most important ones, which I felt we need to talk about, and especially the ones which even I have faced in my interviews, right? So that is the thing which wanted to talk about in this video. Thank you so much again for watching the video. Do stay tuned for more videos like this. Thank you so much.